15-minute history. Francis Tanky Smith and the disappearance of James Winstanley. If you know Leicester at all, you probably know Top Hat Terrace on London Road. You may also have heard of Francis Tanky Smith. Tanky Smith was a Victorian policeman and private detective, famous for his many disguises, some of which are depicted on the front of the houses that make up the terrace. But just who was Tanky Smith, and what was he famous for? It's important to have a little background before we start about the police and crime in Victorian Leicester. The Metropolitan Police Force, or Bobbies, was set up in 1829, and by 1835 local corporations were required by law to set up their own borough police force. It was not greeted with much enthusiasm. Leicester employed Frederick Goodyear, formerly of the Met Police, to set up Leicester's force, consisting of 1 superintendent, 5 sergeants and 35 constables. Leicester itself was rife with crime. There were gangs, public drunkenness, perhaps because beer was a penny a pint and there were 131 beer shops in the town, pickpocketing and robbery, as well as the occasional riot, all took place. The police station was established in what is now the Guildhall. Goodyear had his home here opposite the station. This is a photograph of top-hatted policemen outside the Guildhall and must have been taken sometime in the 1840s. It's also one of the earliest photographs of Leicester Borough Force. A policeman was issued with a reinforced top hat, a truncheon, a rattle to draw attention, handcuffs, but only from 1857 onwards at the cost of 3 pence to the policeman, and for times of real trouble, a navy cutlass. Policemen were paid about 3 shillings a day for a 7-day week, although they were allowed to go to church on Sunday. They were expected also to walk around 20 miles a day. In 1836, there were 116 assaults on Leicester policemen, and there had been 15 attempts to break prisoners out of the cells. By 1839, there were only 3 original officers left. This was not just due to the violence they encountered, but many were dismissed for misconduct. Drunkenness amongst policemen was common. Francis Smith joined in 1840, along with his soon-to-be colleague and friend, Tommy Haynes. He was aged 26. Smith had been born on the 27th of December 1814 and was baptised at St Mary de Castro Church. His father, James, was a needlemaker, and his mother's name was Anne. They lived in the slum court called Bonner's Yard, off Bonner's Lane, near Oxford Street and the Magazine Gateway. These were one-up, one-down slum dwellings, packed into shared courts with shared water pumps and ash pits, sometimes with whole families crowded into one room. In February 1836, at the age of 22, he married Elizabeth Hames at St Margaret's Church. Joining the force at 3 shillings a day probably seemed an improvement for this bright young man. Francis, along with Tommy, became one of the most successful officers in the borough police. In 1843, he and Tommy were awarded 5 shillings for good work. We don't really know what he looked like, and this may or may not be a picture of him, but he was described as tall, thin, distinguished and charismatic. He was also tough, fearless and trustworthy, with an enormous memory, and he was very highly regarded. His partner, Tommy Haynes, was short, round, sallow-faced, enthusiastic and alert, and if this sounds like another famous but fictional pair of detectives, then there is speculation that Francis Smith was one of the inspirations for Sherlock Holmes. Tommy Haynes we know is called Black Tommy because of his sallow complexion, but Tanky is a bit more of a mystery. One suggestion is that the nickname Tanky was due to his habit of tanking unruly yobs around the head with his truncheon. But what about those disguises? Top Hat Terrace shows us a number of his disguises, which include a bishop, a Quaker, and 2 jockeys. Tanky Smith used his disguises to infiltrate criminal gangs, mingle with criminals in public houses, and overhear their conversations. He would then follow them back to their rookeries and hideouts. He was in effect an undercover officer. He used this information to help capture them. Along with Black Tommy, he was very successful in cleaning up Leicester streets. In 1847, a detective force was created, and Smith and Haynes became Leicester's first detective sergeants, moving into plain clothes like these Manchester detectives. By 1853, they had both been promoted to inspectors. Tanky apparently tried to recreate crimes in his head, get into the minds of criminals, and stated he often dreamt the answer to particular problems. In 1862, James Beaumont Winstanley of Braunston Hall was appointed High Sheriff of Leicester at the age of 31. This is not an image of James, but a gentleman of the time as an example. As far as we know, there is only one existing photograph of James. He had inherited the hall and estate when he was 24, and he lived there with his mother and sister. He was educated at Rugby School and then Oxford. He spoke fluent French and had a house in Paris. He travelled a great deal, never staying more than 6 months in one place. In general, he was considered to be a philanthropist and a good landlord on his estate. However, on the 11th of June 1862, he went missing. By the end of June, a reward was being offered for information as to his whereabouts. James Winstanley left his rooms at the Oxford and Cambridge Club in London on the 10th of June 1862 to meet his mother and sister at Folkestone, and he had directed his letters to be sent to him there. There is a version of events where he was meeting his sister only, and prior to departure had had a row with his mother. He stayed the night at the Westcliff Hotel, and at 12 p.m. the next day he was at the door of the hotel preparing to go out and meet the steamer at the Folkestone Quay. His luggage was ready for departure. Knowing the boat arrived at 2 p.m, he asked the landlord if there was time to go to the post office for his letters when returning from the quay and before his luggage must be retrieved. The landlord replied that there would be, thus expecting James to return for his bags that afternoon. James Winstanley then left the hotel, and he was never seen again. When his sister disembarked, not finding him there to meet her, she assumed he had not received her letters stating her arrival, and so took the train to London. For a week his family were not too concerned, but then hearing nothing from him, they raised the alarm. The Coast Guard searched the coast and cliffs, and the police searched the town. Even the Metropolitan Police were involved, but failed to locate him. There was no reason to believe he had fallen in the way of temptation, as the papers reported it, and it was clear that he had intended to be at his investiture as High Sheriff in Leicester at the castle, and to also attend an archaeological congress in Leicester. writing 2 letters to confirm his attendance on the 11th of June. He had, in the meantime, completely vanished. It seems that the family eventually despaired of the efforts of the Folkestone and the Met Police and turned instead to the Borough Police Force and the renowned Tanky Smith. With permission of the Leicester Constabulary, Tanky took up the trail. Leaving from London Road Station and going to Folkestone, he picked up clues so that he travelled to Calais, Cologne, and finally Koblenz in Germany. It appeared that on the 12th of July, the body of a drowned Englishman had been pulled from the River Moselle in Koblenz. By the time Tanky arrived there, the body had been buried as an unknown. The local story was the man had been crossing the river at midnight by ferry near to Leigh, a village 8 miles down the river from Koblenz on the 7th of July, and had fallen in and drowned. Tanky immediately sent a telegram back to Leicester informing the family and his superiors. In the meantime, he arranged for exhumation of the body. He was swiftly joined by the Under-Sheriff William Gregory, James's uncle, the Reverend Thomas Carlion, and James's butler, William French. Although the body was quite badly decomposed, the butler and the Reverend identified the gold cufflinks and collar studs to be those of James Winstanley. Suspiciously, the labels had been cut out from his clothes, but the gold studs and cufflinks not removed. Also, 2 £10 notes from a London bank, obtained by Winstanley, were presented in a bank in Germany. But if he had been robbed, why did they not take his cufflinks and studs as well? Rumour abounded that he had been part of a secret continental organisation and had sought to disassociate himself, but met with foul play instead. Another rumour was that he had been unstable and had killed himself. However, if this was the case, why had burial in a Catholic cemetery been allowed? In a later article in the Leicester Chronicle on the 2nd of August, Tanky Smith was reported as stating James Winstanley had taken steps to prevent being identified and had walked all the way to Koblenz. It's 95 miles, and he had done this somewhere between the 11th of June and the 7th of July. The local judiciary had ruled out accident, murder, and even suicide. So why had he drowned? Why was he on a boat in the middle of the Moselle when he was due to meet his sister and be in Leicester? Sadly, the cause of his death remains speculation. Tanky returned to England and it appears was handsomely rewarded for finding James Winstanley. And this is one of the reasons that we remember Tanky Smith today. The original reward posted had been £10, but Tanky received £1,000 from the family, which is nearly £126,000 today. Was this just a gratuity from the grieving family for his efforts? Or was it hush money about the real circumstances of James's death? In any event, 1 year later, Tanky Smith gave 6 months' notice to the Leicester Borough Police Force, due, he said, to failing eyesight and decreasing strength. He was now 49 years old, living in a house on Hinckley Road, and rather well off. What's more, in that year, 274 arrests were made for drunkenness in the town, and 546 assaults were reported. Perhaps he was just beginning to feel his age. This retirement was not to be without controversy. Halfway through his notice, he was put on a disciplinary charge by Robert Charters, the then Chief Constable, ostensibly for leaving the station without reporting to Charters, as instructed, and failing to report to him at the town hall the following day by 1 p.m. Tanky lodged a counter-complaint. He stated that Charters employed a policeman as his gardener, and that other officers had to make up the difference. Counter-claims of misconduct flew, but eventually Charters was reprimanded for his misuse of an officer, and Tanky was allowed to retire. He politely refused the offer of a pension from the police pension fund. Tanky then took up the profession of Leicester's first private detective. The money he had made was invested in property and land, including buying 1,100 square yards of land which had formerly been allotments on London Road. On this land, Victoria Terrace, or Top Hat Terrace as it is now known, was erected and decorated with the busts of Francis Tanky Smith, either as advertisement or celebration of his achievements. It was designed by his son Francis, by now a well-known Leicester architect. What's more, Francis Street in Stonygate was also purchased and named after him. Francis Tanky Smith died on Sunday the 8th of April 1888 at the age of 73. He was buried at St Magdalen's Church in Knighton on the 11th of April 1888. His death certificate stated that he was a gentleman, which was not bad going for a boy born in the slums of Leicester who pulled himself up by his own bravery, intelligence and police bootstraps.